The sixth episode of Sterne, the weekly talk show about journalism and social justice. I'm your host, Peter Sterne. Tonight, we'll be taking a stern look at public records and the Freedom of Information Act. We've got a great set of guests tonight. First up, Ken Klippenstein, a journalist at The Intercept, and attorney Beth Borden, who often represents Ken in FOIA lawsuits. Then we'll hear from Jason Leopold, a senior investigative reporter at BuzzFeed News, who the FBI once described as a quote-unquote FOIA terrorist because he files so many public records requests. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Morrissey, the co-founder of muckrock.com, a website that helps people file public records requests with different government agencies. One quick note before we begin. We want to hear from our viewers. So whether you're watching this on Haps or on another platform like Facebook or Twitter, you can post comments and questions under the stream and we'll try to respond to them in real time. With that out of the way, we will go to Ken and Beth. Now, Ken and Beth, first of all, can you tell me a little about how you started doing FOIA reporting? Like, how did you guys end up getting together where, Ken, you're filing all these FOIA requests with the government, and then if they're not cooperating, Beth, you represent him and, force them to give him the documents?
Yeah, I've been intrigued with FOIA since I started reporting a few years out of college. I like the idea that you can use primary source documents so that you don't have to rely on the kinds of sourcing that media has tended to use as a crutch, I think. That's not to say that sourcing can't inform FOIA work. Often it does, because you have to know what the records are called and where they're located if you want to have any hope of getting them. And those are folks inside that know the answers to those questions. But it's a nice way to, I don't really make any bones about my politics. Anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that. But having the receipts, having primary source documents, that helps you to elide some of the skepticism that I think is probably healthy for people to have. Think, oh, who's this guy? What are his sources? How do I know if he's credible? Well, it doesn't matter. If you bring the receipts, you've got it all right there. And so that's what I've enjoyed doing. And then also that sort of can force the hand of other media to cover things. If you've got the documentation there, it becomes hard for them to ignore a story because people are passing around something saying, look, here's what it is. And so Beth really came to the picture. We found each other on Twitter. She's a public defender in her day job. She'll tell you more about that, but that really gave her a unique insight into dealing with law enforcement, who are often the agencies that I find most intractable in trying to get records from. And so I've actually learned a ton from her, and she has no formal background in FOIA litigation. So with that, I'll leave it to her to talk a bit about her background.
Yeah, so I've been a public defender since 2005, and as you might expect, I have a lot of trouble getting things from law enforcement. So I know every document they create, at least locally. And at one point I suggested to Ken that if he wanted to get around the feds trying to hide stuff, he could go to local cops. And that's kind of how we started talking. And then at one point, Ken asked if I wanted to get involved in FOIA lawsuits. And it just so happened that I had a death penalty case. I needed mitigation from the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. And I said, yeah, I'll try it. And here we are. We're on our fourth lawsuit now.
That is really, amazing the way that, you are not a media attorney, right? You're a public defender, but you sort of found this journalist and you've been able to have this productive partnership of getting information from agencies to the public.
Yeah, that's the biggest myth in a lot of this stuff, is this notion that you need to be part of some rarefied priest class that knows the secrets about how to get these things. When I chat with people that ask me how to do this stuff, I often try to make the point that the law is pretty narrowly constructed. It's not enormously complicated. That's not to say agencies won't abuse it. 7 Ways to Sunday, they obviously do. But the law itself is not really that complex. And I think, Beth can speak to this. It seems a lot easier for her than some of the, stuff she has to deal with in her other work. So I think there's a sort of misleading idea that, I mean, yes, there's, complex case law and stuff like that. But, at its core, it's not an enormously, complicated piece of legislation. And because of that, I don't think it's hard for someone to jump in. Of course, Beth has some experience dealing with records. She has to use FOIA, or specifically the, Florida records statute to, get records to defend her clients. But again, none of this is like calculus. Like, anybody can pick this up. It'd be nice. I always try to encourage people to, use this tool where they can, if it's useful on a local or municipal level, even. But I mean, really, we joined forces. We've gotten, a heck of a lot of donors who've been very generous with money. And so that's given us, space to litigate things that I didn't have in the past, because I never worked for a big paper that has a ton of money. I never, I didn't have contacts at, some of these national security attorneys, they charge a lot of money. And so, that wasn't really in the cards for me unless you have access.
I'm free.
And what I found is, like, Beth is excellent at this. I mean, we haven't really, we haven't really hit any roadblocks yet that would suggest that you need some kind of special rarefied background in this stuff. We just sort of jumped in.
And so, Beth, have you found that, as Ken says, the law is relatively clear. And so while agencies might refuse to release documents, it's not like they have a lot of legal standing to do that. So is this a case where just threatening a lawsuit or like sending them an angry letter usually pries the documents loose?
I haven't found that to be the case, really. It seems like any email that's sent out doesn't really get much of a response. Once you can finally get someone that's a live person and doesn't look like an automated email replying to you, it's a little easier, but still they like to say, oh, we're working on it. And I don't have that kind of patience, really. So our lawsuits so far have been on ones where they just never responded at all. So that's my experience with it at this point.
Now, I want to we got a great question from Caroline Hart, which I will bring up on the screen now. And she asks, can you give an overview of the different types of records that people can request? Obviously not everything is available that these agencies have. So what are the kinds of records that journalists or ordinary people actually could get out of, say, a local police station or a local government? What can they give out? What can they not give out? And what kinds of records are most useful to reporters in general?
That's a really important question, because, I always say the law is a bit of a misnomer. We don't really have freedom of information. If we, in my opinion, if we have freedom of information, you could have a library or an expert librarian or an expert inside of an agency, on good faith, conduct research for you to learn about a certain subject, as you could in any other institution, a university, for instance. We don't have that. The way the law is construed, they're only required to produce extant documents. They're under no obligation, and there's, ample case law establishing this to conduct any research or produce any new records. So it's really important to know what you're looking for before you go out there. A lot of, novice requesters go out and say, I want to find everything on Mauritania or everything on, trade law or something. And that's just a recipe for disappointment. And I think is part of the reason people give up on FOIA, because they come at it with this kind of good faith approach that, if these agencies, as I said, were, designed to be freedom of information instead of just freedom of documents or freedom of records, they'd be able to answer that, but they can't, because they're not, and they don't, because they're not required to. And then, they don't really help people figure out how to better craft things in many cases. So, in my experience as a reporter, maybe this looks different for different folks. I try to talk to people that were in the agencies that produce those records, whether that's, people that are inside currently, people that have retired. They'll know where everything's located. They'll know the names. Whereas to me, that's a lot more efficient than this kind of Google-centric approach people have, where they think they can just, find all their answers online. And to some extent, that's true, and you can do that. But not everything is indexed on the internet. There's a whole lot of knowledge that is just word of mouth. So to answer your question, that really depends on what subject. So if you're looking at law enforcement, I would talk to a reporter that reports on law enforcement, or maybe a retired cop, or in Beth's case, I mean, there's the surface area for a lot of these things it touches on a lot of different fields. So you don't have to necessarily be a cop to know about cop records. Beth's a public defender, and that's how she knows the types of police records that are generated. But I have to say, I tried the Google-centric approach, just looking up what was out there, or even just talking to reporters, and their knowledge was limited to what reporters tend to look at. It's not that they're bad, they're good reporters, but certain things won't occur to you if you don't have a need to, try to ferret out certain records in a way that Beth's experience has afforded her some extra insight, or any other type of maybe if you want to learn about law enforcement, maybe there's a professor of Homeland Security or something. There's so many different angles you can go at this from. But what I try to encourage people to do is to go at it from a human angle, and don't necessarily just be Googling everything. Try to talk to people that are in this line of work, and you'd be surprised what sorts of things they might be able to think of that even other folks focus on the same sorts of records won't be able to.
And Beth, can you go into more detail on what kinds of records are available from these agencies?
Some of the ones that I really like the most, I like calls for service. Those are specific to an address. So if you want to find out how many times has law enforcement shown up to a particular address, that would be a calls for service document that you would want. I also like something called a CAD. It's a computer aided dispatch, and it's also called a call detail record in some locations. But anytime a 911 call is initiated, or a law enforcement officer is flagged down or pulls someone over, once they start talking on their radio, or once the call begins, everything is in a computer code, and it runs all the way through until the end of the call. And those two things will help you a lot to determine where you want to go from there. Sometimes you only have a CAD, sometimes you only have a call for service, and you don't end up with a police report. So those are generally my starting points to tell people to look for these things. Also, every time they're on the radio on their shoulder, that's audio recorded, radio chatter. You can request radio chatter. And sometimes officers, they have computers in their cars. Sometimes they'll be on Messenger chatting away, not realizing every single bit of that is discoverable as a public record. So those are some unique items that I think people don't necessarily think of when they think of what things law enforcement generates.
Right. It's not just the police reports. What are things that law enforcement generates that they don't have to release through Freedom of Information Act?
Well, if there's an ongoing investigation, they don't have to give you anything related to that. If there's some sort of investigative technique, they don't have to provide you anything like that. They will not give you internal affairs files that are related to an open shooting investigation, and internal affairs files on law enforcement officers, at least here where I am in Orlando, they keep those for 7 years, and once the officer quits or is fired, they no longer have those available to provide to you.
Okay. And I think you said that you and Ken have done 4 cases together so far?
Yes.
What were those cases about? What are some, I guess, success stories from the tag team of Ken and Beth?
Ken, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So this is really collaborative in that, I have what I'm interested in as a reporter, but then Beth has what she knows exists that I'm not aware of. So when she was talking about CAD reports, call detail reports, these, peculiar types of text messages that are unique to whatever sort of computer system that they have, none of this stuff was, obvious to me when I started reporting. I started talking to her, and I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. So then, I run by her, I'd like to know about intelligence reports that these agencies are producing, because they work closely after 9/11 with the Department of Homeland Security. Many, big police departments have what are called fusion centers. It's these kind of nodes in this web of, this is one of the big untold stories of the post 9/11 era, is the establishment of this huge, complex sort of internecine web of these these fusion centers that's producing intelligence. And I thought, well, there's unprecedented protests going on right now, unprecedented unrest. Can you imagine what's in there? And so, Beth and I got together talking, and her coming at this from a state and local perspective, we thought, well, either I can go through DHS and wait, a year for, a lawsuit to make its way through the courts, or we can go through it locally, and she was able to find something called a writ of mandamus that you can file that gives you a much faster production schedule and essentially get the same records, but from a state and local domain rather than from a federal one. And so that has kind of governed our approach. We've launched lawsuits in Florida, but we're also approaching ones in, for instance, California and Oregon. You can file them anywhere, and they're much quicker at the state and local level. So there's a lot of strategy involved, thinking, where may records be, available copies. I mean, this is really, long story short, I think that this is like the exhaust port of the Death Star of this surveillance state, which is that they collect information on everything. And part of that is that they love to share it with their intelligence and law enforcement buddies. And so that creates a weakness, that creates a structural weakness, which is that there's records everywhere that one can get. Because there's a sort of continuum between, secrecy and intelligence sharing. So the more sharing they have, the more these fusion nodes, the more opportunity there is for people like us to kind of wrest loose these types of records, because there's so many of them everywhere. And that's kind of, I would say, that's how I would characterize our approach generally.
So it seems like these fusion centers and all this sharing between federal, state, and local law enforcement means that all of that intelligence is requestable either at the federal level or the state level or the local level.
Yeah,
and it's the same intelligence.
There's a lot of duplication. So these local agencies will be read into federal intelligence products, but then once it enters into state, then that is governed by a completely different set of rules than federal. In some cases, that can be more expedient to the purposes of the requester. In other cases, it can be worse, but it's different. And so, that's a whole nother avenue to approach these things from.
Is it difficult to figure out which laws apply, since the laws are different by every different jurisdiction?
I only really know federal. I mean, Beth is the expert in Florida, but there's attorneys practicing everywhere. And so again, the human approach, don't learn it all. I mean, you have people that try to learn, just read the statutes. To me, that's insane. Like, just go to someone who's been doing this for years. There's no way you're going to be able to read something. And another thing is, like, the words on paper, that only means, something like they're going to be interpreted a different way by the courts. There's going to be different case law behind them. The reality is that judges tend to be pretty deferent to law enforcement. And so to get a lay of the land and figure out, well, what's going to tend to work, you got to really talk to someone who's tried to do this type of stuff before, not necessarily open records litigation, but some familiarity with the court process and sort of the culture there.
So I guess it seems like FOIA, or to be more accurate, public records requesting, since there are, FOIA is the federal law and there are so many at the state level, that is not a substitute for reporting. That has to be a complement to the sort of traditional reporting of calling up sources.
In my view,
yeah,
I think, the FOIA culture tends to be more what I've been saying, a lot of this open source research, which I don't mean to discount. That stuff is very important and useful. But, you're going to have a hard time if you don't have somebody who's worked in that agency or is familiar with that agency who's going to be able to tell you, because these places do not always come at it from a position of good faith and say, well, this guy basically means this, let's tell him where it is. In many cases, they'll withhold that kind of information from you, and then they essentially don't need to reply. So, but if you've got a guy who's able to say, like Beth was saying, ask for a call detail record or a CAD report, that's very specific, and it becomes hard for the records custodian to, they can't just say, yeah, we don't have cats. At that point, you've got something that exists and is real, and then you're off to the races, I think.
So the more that you know that a document exists and they have to have it, and you can specifically ask for that specific document, then you have a better chance than if you just say, I want anything you have that's related to this. And then they can kind of, delay you and deny that it exists.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we've had ridiculous. We're in the process of requesting State Department diplomatic cables, and they're saying they're acting like they don't know what diplomatic cables are to give people a sense of what they are in the context of the State Department. That's like saying that's like going to a I don't know, Jiffy Lube and saying like in them saying we don't know what a muffler is. It's like this is their whole reason for being is to produce these diplomatic reports. I mean, that's what the State Department is for. So they clearly know what it is. I can only speculate why they're claiming not to, but you end up having to, produce things that are extant in the public record and say, hey, look, here's some diplomatic cables that got published under FOIA a few years ago, or here's a diplomat who mentioned them in an interview with the Times. So, sources are sort of a starting point, and they tell you what they are, and then you need to try to gather evidence to show that what exists does in fact exist. But that's all. I mean, if you bring it in a court context, then things are a lot more reasonable. Suddenly, with a federal judge sitting there, they become a little bit more easy to. They become a little bit more down to earth in terms of like being like, yeah, okay, yeah, we know what diplomatic cables are.
So the last thing I want to ask you before we go on to Jason is you also get documents not through FOIA. People just instead of saying, oh, you should ask for the specific document, they will leak you documents. And I'm curious if something is leaked and made public, can you then request it through FOIA, or can they say it doesn't exist? What if it's something that wouldn't have to be disclosed under FOIA, but there is a copy of it that has been published? If it's a classified document, like what is sort of the relationship between getting documents through FOIA and public records and like the law versus just getting documents from people who have them in their possession?
Yeah, I wanted to say there's a lot of sanctimony about leaking. And it's driven into the intelligence community's head that you're some kind of terrorist or a traitor or something if you disclose something. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. That's a concern that I have, and I also don't want to. I genuinely don't want to imperil any sort of investigations or get spies killed overseas or anything like that. Not that I'm in a situation that could happen. So I agree with them in principle, anyways. But the way they go about applying this sort of culture of secrecy is to just say, don't tell anyone anything. That's the cultural assumption at play in the intelligence and law enforcement world too. But when they disclose a lot of these things and you're able to compare them, all the same exemptions are still at play. So if you're leaked something and it has all the contents, it doesn't matter. It's still, whatever was exempt before is still exempt. However, you can request something. I've done this before. It's very instructive. You can look at the leaked copy, see what's under there, and then look at what they redact. And it's really instructive what they redact because they redact a lot more than what's legitimately sensitive. And I've done this repeatedly. And I'm sure I'll give you an example. There was a requester, I think it was Stephen Aftergood. He requested the same document, just 3 different requests from the same agency, maybe from different agencies. And he took a look and see what he got back. Different redactions in every case. Now, some of that might be legitimate, cognitive bias. Maybe someone interprets something a different way. That's fine. But a lot of it is just that this law is not very evenly applied, and then they try to redact as much as they possibly can. That's the most striking thing about seeing the leaked document versus what's disclosed to the public via official channels. And another point I want to make is that sort of like with the drug war, there's kind of supply and demand thing where the higher demand is for leaked documents, that's going to be reflective of a lower compliance on the part of the government with public disclosures. Because if FOIA was easier, there'd be no reason to go and find sources that leak things to you. So really, when you see leaks, that's a reflection of the formal process isn't working. Not that there's some horrible traitor or something in government necessarily. So all that being said, once you get them leaked, the same stuff is still exempt, but it's a really fun game to go through and request it and see, oh, that's interesting. They're claiming this line is exempt for law enforcement reasons, but I've got the actual thing here and there's nothing sensitive. This is marked unclassified. Why do they do that? Well, people can imagine why they do that, but that is what I see again and again, and is extremely amusing to do.
And now, Beth, do you find that do courts get mad if Ken gets documents not through the legal process, and then you're trying to get similar documents or complementary documents through the legal process? Or are they more difficult to deal with because they don't like that Ken is also getting it illegally, or does that not really come into play?
It hasn't come into play for me yet. And I don't know, I would imagine it's a different culture for the courts in DC. I'm filing here in the Middle District of Florida in Orlando, and they don't get a lot of FOIA cases to begin with. The first one that we filed was in October of 2019, and it was against ICE. And the assistant United States attorney on the case said that his prior FOIA case had been 14 years before. So it's probably a little bit different here as to what the judges will and won't get upset about than it is in the District of Columbia.
Our experience is quite distinct from a lot of the national media, which tends to be really DC centric, or maybe New York, where they litigate a lot of these things. And, you know, courts vary a lot. I mean, it's not necessarily like uniformly better to have someone unfamiliar with the law, but there are certain advantages because, for example, in the course of our litigation in Florida, they were filing, you know, responses that were just flatly not something that's going to pass muster in any kind of legal context, because it's clear the guy doesn't know what the heck is going on.
Yeah.
So that can be beneficial. But, you know, I mean, the downside is that then, you know, you're fighting with them over very basic stuff that they clearly don't understand. So it's a much different experience. I honestly don't know that I have any experience going about it the sort of Beltway-centric approach, which is overwhelmingly what media tends to do.
And just before we go to Jason, speaking of that Beltway approach, we have a question from Cameron, who says, has anyone leaked audio recordings to you? Are there differences between written documents and audio recordings? Is it harder to authenticate audio recordings? And I guess I will just add on to that. Are audio recordings also subject to all the same laws as written documents? So do they also have to be disclosed?
Oh yeah, same stuff, same exemptions. That's what's cool about FOIA, at least in principle. It applies to, you know, basically everything, you know, exemptions notwithstanding. So yeah, you can FOIA those. You can FOIA just about anything. If it's a, you know, the idea is that it's a, you know, government record, taxes paid for it. You know, they're doing, government depends on the consent of the governed. So, you know, this is supposed to be something that in theory is releasable. I've never actually gotten an audio one, or actually I have before, but I haven't used it. You know, it's, yes, I've gotten leaked ones as well. You know, verification is just a case-by-case matter. I mean, have you known this guy for a while? Has he, you know, provided authentic stuff in the past? You can run it by other people. You can ask their public affairs. I mean, there's really no one way to do it. But I mean, Beth would be able to speak more to, Beth, that you've probably done a lot with like 911 calls and things like that, right?
Well, 911 calls are a little different. I mean, that's coming from the government agency, and, you know, no one's leaking me a 911 call, but if they did, there's certain indicators along the way you can tell what is and is not authentic with that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Beth and Ken. I know we talked for longer than I had anticipated. If you're able to stay around, you know, hopefully we'll be able to do a longer panel discussion at the end. But I also understand if you have to get going. Next, we will go and talk to Jason. Now, Jason, you are a senior investigative reporter at BuzzFeed News, right?
Yes, correct.
And how long have you been at BuzzFeed?
A couple of weeks will be 4 years.
Okay. And you're based in DC, right?
I'm based in LA.
Oh, you're based in LA. Okay.
And let them think that, because when they come looking for me, I'll be in LA.
But you do a lot of, I think Ken described it as like that Beltway sort of FOIA, where you're FOIAing federal agencies a lot.
I am FOIAing federal agencies a lot, which basically goes along with you know, some of the projects that I work on. So I hit up the federal agencies, you know, more or less to kind of dig into, you know, what's happening behind the scenes. Maybe it may relate to a program or something that I've heard about. And And yeah, so I'm not sure I would characterize it as a beltway, but it is, more about what's happening in the bowels of these agencies, whether they're, working on a program or there's an investigation that took place that may be classified, that the public needs to know about or I want to dig into.
And so if an investigation is classified or a program is classified, is that disclosable under FOIA?
Yeah. And it depends on what it is. So just as an example, when I was digging into Zero Dark 30, the movie that many believe that the CIA played a role in producing, there was an Inspector General investigation related to that. And it was classified because anything that the CIA or NSA or many of these other intelligence agencies do, by and large, is classified. The CIA has a CIA Act and the NSA Act, which essentially means that everything they do is classified and, more or less not subject to disclosure. So, once you sue the agency, or even when you file the request, and you can file a request in multiple different ways, you can ask for anything. Doesn't mean they have to give it to you. But they'll go through the process to determine what can be declassified as a result. I've had this long-running FOIA case against the NSA for IG reports going back to 2015, 16. And they're basically, declassifying many of those reports. Like I said, just by the fact that they are the NSA, everything is classified.
But by suing them, you force them to either justify why it's classified or to declassify it and release it.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that as well without suing. It'll just take you years and years and years and years. But you can also file a mandatory declassification review. It's not FOIA, but it's in the family, where you can essentially, pitch yourself to, or pitch a panel of security experts who sit on a board to take a look at a certain set of documents that exist, that is classified, to make a determination as to whether or not it can be declassified. That works best for historical records, and you do need to know exactly what records you're seeking. However, I've done it for records over the past 10 years. The response time is quicker, and the rate of disclosure is actually far higher than FOIA. The only difference is that you can't do both. You can't file a mandatory declassification review and a FOIA at the same time. So you got to pick one. And if you lose on the mandatory declassification review, depending on what the record is, and if it's something that many people are looking for, it kind of shuts it down for 2 years, where you can't even ask for it, and you wouldn't be able to get it. But anyway, yeah, I mean, when it comes to CIA, NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency, I mean, if I'm filing a request with those agencies, I know I'm suing those agencies, depending on what it is.
So they always refuse?
I'm sorry?
They always refuse, and you have to take them to court?
It's not that they refuse. It's just that it takes a very, very long time to try and pry loose those records. So I'm using, if I'm filing a request, for example, like I said, I use Zero Dark 30 as an example. I was actually doing an investigation as to whether or not, the CIA actually did play a role, in producing that. And so, it kind of helped, spur, the release of those records by just kind of litigating right away. Otherwise, I mean, the average wait time is, 5 years.
Whereas if you sue, it would happen more quickly in like a year or so, or even quicker?
Yeah, I would say about, I mean, depending on what it is, it could be a year. I always hope that it's less than that. But that's about the average. I mean, last year I actually sued last March, right? Maybe a week or two before COVID hit, before it was declared a pandemic, I sued CIA for a bunch of IG reports. And the CIA is an agency that has escaped any scrutiny over the past 4 years, and generally just obviously operates in secrecy. So I sued them last year, and because of COVID and because the agencies have been kind of using that as a way to thwart their responsibility of producing records, and essentially saying that they can't get to the office because everything's on classified servers there, which is true to some extent, but I have not been able to kind of get that case moving. So we've been in limbo for about a year, and I haven't seen any records yet. But with those kinds of agencies, those records will, in my opinion, always have value, even if it's taking some time to pry it loose, because, like I said, it's classified. So the effort, the work that goes into trying to pry loose records, that is highly classified and may be classified at a, whether it's a secret, top secret, or, SCI level, compartmentalized, there's value in it. There's value in, trying to pry loose a record that, you're going to write about, or I'm going to write about, that may be, something that took place 5 years ago, that I'm only getting now, because otherwise it's just, that's just how long it takes to kind of get to that place, short of someone leaking a set of records to you.
So when you are filing these like FOIA lawsuits, for example, or even the mandatory declassification review, what you're looking for, because, sort of as with what Ken was saying, like, you've done reporting. You've talked to people sort of in those agencies who tell you what to look for, right?
I speak to those people all the time, regularly. Yes. I mean, it is, for me, it's crucial to speak to those people. Just one, you want to just keep tabs on, on the agency and what they're doing. And there are many agencies that, as I mentioned, that kind of go unnoticed, right? If you go into USA.gov, you'll see hundreds of federal agencies that exist, agencies that, many people may not even have heard of. But it's by and large, it's the agencies that are, what I refer to as like the mainstream agencies that, get lots and lots of attention, like DOD, FBI, State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and its components that are getting much of the attention. So, it's these other agencies that I'm sort of looking at to see what's taking place behind the scenes. What's their job? What's their responsibility? What are they doing? Have there been whistleblowers there? Have there been people who have been trying to expose waste, fraud, and abuse? What's something that happened within this agency? What are they responsible for that I can investigate? And like I said, you want to know if there are records available that that could be shared, and second, what do they have that I can go after, short of someone actually providing those records?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my question, is if someone is telling you what the agency has, why wouldn't they just leak you the documents instead of telling you, you should FOIA this?
Well, because there is not, I mean, I heard, what, I don't know who was speaking before about leaking. People, there's not much of an incentive for people to leak. People who leak are taking a great risk, to do that. And I don't care if it's like some dumb intelligence bulletin that is based on open source info, or if it's something that has far greater value. But the reality is that this government, and it doesn't matter who's in office, does not look kindly on such disclosures. So someone that that would be doing anything would be taking such a great risk by disclosing that kind of information. But not only that, by having any sort of contact with a journalist as well. So it's not just disclosing records, it's just that the contact, you know?
Right. I mean, it seems like people are already taking a big risk if they are telling you that these documents exist. But is it seen as an even bigger risk to actually give you the document than to tell you that it exists?
Is it a bigger risk to give me a document? Probably. It's probably a far greater risk to, you know, to give the document. I mean, there's all sorts of operational security issues that you have to ensure that someone's following. Again, you know, in terms of whether it's a prosecution, I think it's obviously, you know, better for the person who's leaking if what they're providing is not, you know, highly classified or not revealing sources and methods, or, you know, that's not going to, you know, in the event that they get caught, you know, that it's not going to be something that hurts them. But it doesn't even really matter these days. I mean, because, you know, in some ways the government just sort of looks at leaks, you know, any type of leak is, you know, is terrible. You know, there were a set of documents that I received last week that revealed, this was related to the Mueller investigation, that revealed the Justice Department is actually still investigating leaks to the Washington Post from 2017, which I hadn't known that before. And the information, whatever it is they're looking into, does not seem that, you know, that damaging, right? What's the damage assessment associated from it? Doesn't seem like there's anything, but, you know, they're very aggressive. You know that, Peter. So
yeah,
I mean,
of course.
as far as you know, listeners are concerned, I mean, I think that, again, it's, you know, the government is just so, this administration, the last administration, and the one before that, and you can go way back, they're just highly secretive. Information that should not have to be FOIA, there should be proactive disclosures, or it's just not being disclosed. So because they just don't want to share anything, they don't want to be transparent. There is no real incentive for them to be transparent, which is why when I do get records very quickly from a particular agency, I'm like, aha, they want this to be out there, you know. So, but I think that, again, you know, just getting back to, you know, issues around leaking, it's such a sensitive subject, you know. I think that, you know, people who are disclosing that kind of information are, you know, are heroes, champions, and they really believe that the information needs to be disclosed, that there may be waste, fraud, or abuse, or something else taking place, that they're willing to put themselves at such great risk to disclose it, which is why I think that, you know, it's crucial that, you know, that take whatever steps we can to, you know, protect these people.
Absolutely. And you take steps, you know, when you're contacting people in these agencies, as you were talking about this operational security,
right,
to make sure that, you know, your sources are safe. Can you detail some of like the lengths that you and your sources have to go to try to make sure that they're not going to get in trouble for talking to a journalist?
Absolutely not. I am not going to detail anything related to, like, you know, sources or methods at all. You know, I appreciate the question, but, you know, it's tough because it's, you know, you're constantly just trying to find ways to ensure that someone is safe. There are many instances where, you know, you have to kind of walk people through the various steps that they have to take. But yeah, I would just, you know, I'm going to avoid that question.
And do you think that sort of judicious use of FOIA is a way of keeping sources safe because it avoids them having to, like, actually give you a document even if they're telling you about its existence?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Well, the question was just, do you think that sort of using FOIA is a way of keeping sources safe because then they don't have to leak you the document themselves? They can just let you know about its existence, and then you can try and do it through more or less, you know, legal means.
Right. Well, It depends, Peter. By the way, I see that it's kind of dark here, so I don't want people to think I'm like hiding behind some sort of, shadowy, speaking undercover or something. It depends, because the nature of the document itself, just the mere existence of a document, could be classified, and the title of a document could be classified. So if you file a request and you're very, very specific on a certain document that's classified, well, an agency may want to know, how does this person know that this document exists? And that itself would, could be determined to be a, unauthorized disclosure. So I think that, again, it also depends on what the specific record is that I'm seeking. If I'm seeking specific records related to, the CIA's torture program, which I spent many, many years litigating over, and prying loose, tens of thousands of pages, my request was very, very broad. So I knew how to kind of make it broad to kind of capture the universe of records. And that's usually what I do when I litigate, because I want to get something out of an agency. But so when it comes to a specific record, one, I want to know that it exists, but I don't want to give away, the possibility that someone may have disclosed the existence of the record. So I may ask for something a bit more broader that kind of captures the, the record or the universe of records. Again, that's something that, just because someone tells you something exists, and again, it depends on the agency, but that could be classified as well, which is why I always ask that question.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because it's sort of the opposite of the strategy that Ken was talking about when you're going after records that are not classified, where, if it's not illegal to disclose the existence of this record, then it makes sense to file a very specific FOIA request, because then they will have to admit that it exists. But if you're talking,
thing exists. I mean, there are many, many different ways in which an agency can thwart, the release of records. I'm sure that, Michael Morrissey has, can attest to that, as well as the, thousands of people who use Muckrock to file the request. There have been instances when I file a request for a record and an agency says that they can't find it, even though I know it exists and I know the, the system of record where it's, where it's kept, where I've identified, exactly where they can find it. So, that's something to just note, is that there are certain agencies that will essentially try to say they can't find something, that the search is too broad, that you didn't reasonably describe records. It is a battle, so let me just sort of let your listeners, viewers know that it's a battle. When you're going, into doing this type of work, trying to pry loose records, you should go into it knowing that, you need to prepare for battle. And that there are many ways in which you can pry loose the record. One, knowing what the statute says, knowing what the various case law says, or how the cases were determined over the years, in favor of requesters, in favor of disclosure. Having, when you get a response from an agency saying that you can't have these records, knowing how to appeal. Those are things that I do on a daily basis. That ultimately, short of suing, is a path toward getting an agency to release records. So really understanding language, the language that you can use, whether it's asking for an estimated date of completion, whether it's challenging an agency on their use of a privacy exemption. What I've found is that many of the FOIA analysts who are simply just trying to get these records through, there have been many instances, particularly over the past year, where they've been told by, political appointees not to release certain records. And they will come up with whatever exemption, So it's not even something that's actually based on anything other than they don't want that to be out there. So you have to know how to appeal that. Sometimes an agency will say, oh, we couldn't find these records. I'll sue. And then suddenly they're able to find the records. So it is a painstaking, tedious process. It's not as easy as, as people make it sound, but the payoff can be huge and incredibly rewarding.
So what are some stories that you've done over the years that have relied on FOIA and public records?
Let's see. There's a lot of them that, go back many, many years when I used to work at Vice News, a bunch there. But, recently, there was back in, way back in 2020, December 2020, which feels like 10 years ago already. There were the emails that, that I obtained from GSA. If you recall, if viewers recall that the GSA administrator was not ascertaining the election in favor of Biden after Election Day. There were questions about what was happening, why she was doing that, why she was not, rather, ascertaining the election in favor of Biden. So I asked for a bunch of, asked for her emails, asked for emails between, her office and the White House, and they just turned over like 700 pages of records, which does show quite a bit of correspondence between them. There was the criminal referral that that the Inspector General of the intelligence community filed against Donald Trump after that call in 2019, July 2019, with the president of Ukraine. That sparked the impeachment against him. There was actually a criminal referral on the president that was sent to DOJ and FBI. I asked for that criminal referral. It took the agency over a year to give it to me, that was December as well. Let me see here. There was another one that I file a bunch of FOIA sometimes just for fun to have to sort of like get out of the sort of darkness. There was one on Eminem. Eminem rapped in his new album that, the Secret Service visited him. I listened to that song and I was like, wonder what that's about. So I filed a request with Secret Service. It took him a year to turn over records on Eminem, and I couldn't believe it. There were agents questioning Eminem, in an office, in his lawyer's office in Century City, California. And they started reading the lyrics, to one of his songs, which, talked about, Donald Trump and Ivanka in the trunk of his car. And as they're reading the lyrics to him, he starts rapping back, to the agents. That was a really fun one. That's one of my favorites. There's a bunch of records on Guantanamo. I spent years and years and years covering Guantanamo, and it's a black hole of secrecy there. The only way to really pry loose any information is through FOIA. And I'm still getting those records. That's a case that has been ongoing for me for nearly a decade. I mentioned,
and why does it take so long? Not just for the records to eventually get released, but once they start releasing the records, it can take years for them to finish releasing the records. Is that because you're litigating over what exactly they need to release in addition to what they've released so far? Or is that because they say there are so many records, we can only process it, 100 pages a month kind of thing?
Yeah, it is part of that. So basically what happens is that you file a lawsuit. The agency, now I'm only talking about federal. Obviously on the state level, it's all different. You file a lawsuit against an agency, they have 30 days to respond, and you can go into some briefing. So you're talking about like almost 2 months before they sort of get settled into your suit. And it all depends, again, on the agency. When you're dealing with an agency like United States Southern Command, which has oversight of Guantanamo, you know, you are dealing with some highly classified information, and an agency that does not have a very large FOIA staff. So, you know, on the in some ways, you are getting to go on top of the pile, right? When you file a lawsuit, you know, you advance, if you will, to the top of the pile. So that means an agency has to start processing records and producing. So you set a production schedule. You know, you try to get as many pages as you can per month. You know, an agency may identify 20, 30,000 pages of records. Well, they can't just give it to you, you know, 10,000 pages a month, because they just don't have the resources to do that. So they say what they're able to process, right? Our resources only allow us to process 400 pages a month. We try to go up and negotiate. Give us 700, give us 1,000. You know, so you meet in the middle someplace. Then you're dealing with records that are classified, right? And where there are multiple agencies have equities in those records. So one email, you know, could end up going to 10 different agencies to review, because the FBI, the DOD, State Department, DHS, they all may have some, you know, equity in those records. And, you know, that takes some time for them to go through it. So, you know, the wheels are just spinning, and it's, you know, that's how long it ultimately takes. And then they may find some records along the way, or something may happen where they can't produce 400 records or, you know, per month. But 4,800 records a year, 4,800 pages of documents, you know, like I said, with Guantanamo, I think there's 30 or 40,000 pages that they have. You can see how long that is, right? It's like over 8 years.
And so they've said there are 30,000 or so responsive records that they then need to go through. They have not said that there are 30,000 that they can release.
No, that's right. There are about like 30,000 pages that they estimate that they have. And then they review those records to determine, you know, what can be released, what cannot be released. So you see, I'm not even in the litigation stage of actually litigating the redactions. They are just saying to me, and obviously my attorney, this is what can be released. And this is what, you know, we think, you know, we can do on a monthly basis. Only when the case is over that, you know, then can I go back 8 years later in this case and say, yeah, what you gave me back in 2013, that B5 redaction, we want to challenge all that, you know? So that's essentially, you know, that you're at the mercy of those, you know, the agencies. But it's the best, you know, it's the best that we have.
Yeah. And then they can give you documents that are heavily redacted. And then at the end of the case, you can go back and say, we think you should, you know, unredact large portions of this. What about documents that they just say, we can't give you at all? How do you know what hasn't been released?
Well, in that case, they may give a Vaughn index. And a Vaughn index is essentially, you know, the agency is describing what it's withholding. An index of all the documents that it's withheld, you know, what the exemptions under FOIA are, and then a summary of essentially kind of like, what is this document? What does it pertain to? What's being discussed? A Vaughn index, depending on what you're asking for, can be very newsworthy and valuable. You know, back in 2016, so I, as you may know, you know, it was my FOIA request that forced the release of all of Hillary Clinton's emails. And there were some classified emails there that, or, you know, emails that they would not release at all to us. And they described what those emails were. For example, some of those emails were like, a birthday wish to President Obama. Why? I don't know why they didn't release it, but the point is like they described what was in, what the substance was, not exactly what was said, but what it related to. CIA does the same thing. They may describe, what kind of document it is, why it can't be disclosed. It may interfere with diplomatic relations, or reveal foreign sources of money. In the case of the FBI, oftentimes they'll say, would reveal, a confidential source, but they describe generally what the record is they're withholding. So, and then you could challenge that and say, well, we challenge, what, the justification for the withholding. With CIA, for example, I've been trying for years to go after the agency's studies on arming Syrian rebels. And at first, under Obama, they sent me a Galomar response. They could neither confirm nor deny. Then under, Trump, when Trump tweeted about it, I filed a FOIA request. He tweeted about it saying he was ending it. That was my opening. Boom. I'm in. Give me those records. This is what we call an official disclosure by an original classification authority, and the president is the ultimate classification authority. Give me those records. They still issued a Galomar. We challenged it. We won. We beat the Galomar. Didn't mean that the agency had to give us the records. It just meant that they had to process my request and then determine, if they have records, if they wanted to withhold it, they have to come up with another reason. So, that's actually, the CIA actually appealed that. That case is ongoing, but, that's essentially what happens. If an agency doesn't want to give you a record, then you get into litigation and you have to come up with arguments as to why they're wrong, why their justification for using a certain FOIA exemption or multiple FOIA exemptions, is wrong. It's not based in, their interpretation of the law is wrong. So that's the fight you get into. Sometimes you could get into a negotiation, where, listen, if you just don't challenge anything else on this, we'll reprocess some records and, maybe we'll disclose some more information. But again, this is like part of the game, though, this is what I'm talking about. This is the tedious, painstaking work, whether or not the law being written is not that lengthy, the statute itself, it is work involved to get these records. When you write a FOIA request, it is very important, in my humble opinion, to, have a template that is more of an instructional manual that will tell a FOIA analyst, exactly where they can find the records, and to ensure that it's litigation proof, that every word that you're putting into that request, that an agency, a government attorney can't tell a judge, well, he used the word and it should have been or, because we didn't understand that. I mean, little things like that I've seen, FOIA cases get dismissed. So it's painstaking work.
So even if you're doing a broad request, you need to make sure that it's not just like a careless request. It has to be worded very carefully. Otherwise, they'll deny.
I mean, look, it says that you just have to reasonably describe the records you seek. An agency, again, will do anything to try and get out of doing that, even if you do reasonably describe the records you seek. I've done this, multiple times with, certain agencies where I tell them exactly what I'm looking for, and they will respond with, your request is too broad. I have legal language on how to appeal it. I have the language. I know exactly how to appeal that. But I just happen to be leaving me out of it for people that do get that kind of response. They don't know. And so the agency is actually telling other people, other requesters, thousands, hundreds of other requesters, even though they're reasonably describing records, that the request is too broad. And that is, troublesome, right? Because if someone simply did what the law dictates, then they're doing a great job in terms of what they're asking for. But agencies will come up with all sorts of reasons. So you just have to know how to respond to them.
Well, and I think that brings us to Michael, who you're familiar with, and Michael's whole goal is to create a website that allows ordinary people to kind of navigate that FOIA process. And as you said, sort of have that template.
Yeah, I just want to sing Michael's praises, by the way, for everyone. So I will do that.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason. We'll go now to Michael. So, Michael, certainly you heard about what Jason was saying in terms of the difficulty that people who, maybe don't have a lot of experience filing FOIA requests or don't have a lot of legal resources to litigate these FOIA requests will have trouble with. Because even if they just, use the wrong word, an agency could take that as an excuse to reject the request. So can you tell me a little about, what you've done, what you're doing with Muckrock to enable ordinary people, ideally, to make successful public records requests?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, speaking of singing praises, I think I've learned so much from Jason over the years, just kind of looking at what he requests and seeing how open he is with his process. And I think that's been one of the really cool things in the past decade with the FOIA community is how much more of a community it's become and how much more open people are with their process, what they're requesting, what they're seeing working, what's not working. And that was not really there to the extent that it is today, certainly, but wasn't nearly as lively as it was 5, 6 years ago, and certainly not 11 years ago when we started Muckrock. Because it, despite this being in public records, a lot of times the FOIA process was between an individual and an agency. And the agency has all the resources. They have all the lawyers, they have all the money, they have all the time, and they know what the documents are. And I was really interested in sort of what do we do as sort of local journalism really continues to struggle as we're seeing fewer reporters dedicated to investigative journalism. What would be something that we could invest some time and maybe try a new approach to encourage more accountability at a variety of level that journalism has traditionally provided in communities around the country. And so when we were thinking about it, we looked at a lot of decades of investigative reporting. We looked at what kinds of reporting ended up making changes for the better within governments, what led to reforms, what led to resignations, what led to impact. And time again, what leads to impact is sort of having source materials to kind of back up your reporting. And I think this is something that the other panelists have talked a lot about, is just sort of, it's really hard for people to dismiss something or deride something if you have documents that are backing this up. And if you can kind of go out and it's no longer he said, she said, but it's now, here's your own words in these memos I got or these emails I got, it's a lot harder for people to kind of make media the bad guy. And it's also a great opportunity for, if you're a journalist or if you're trying to, maybe you don't have a great or existing reputation within journalism, people don't need to be able to trust you if you can kind of go say, hey, here's the materials I got, here's how I got them. It doesn't really matter anything about me, whether you trust me or not. It matters what these materials say. And that's really powerful, especially these days for reporters, where a lot of people don't trust the media and so on. So a decade ago, we were really interested in sort of what could we do. We got really interested in FOIA. I'd filed a few public records requests myself. None of them went anywhere. And so we said, what if we took this process that is still largely paper driven? A lot of agencies use fax machines still, and put a digital kind of wrapper around that process. And then encouraged and made it really easy for people to share their requests publicly. So on Muckrock, if you're a journalist or if you're a reporter, or maybe you're working on a advocacy campaign, you can keep your requests private while you're waiting for documents to get back or for a period after they come back. but we encourage all of our users to make their requests public whenever they can, so that other people can build on that work, and so other people can see that process. And so it's been really cool to kind of see this really amazing transparency community develop on the website. We just filed our 90,000th request a couple of weeks ago, and we've helped publish millions of pages of previously secret documents, which is really exciting. So the idea was just make it easier for journalists and non-journalists, activists and ordinary people to kind of use this really important bedrock law that really grants access to everybody in a way that traditionally it's been an intimidating process. And so we tried taking away that process and making it as simple as possible.
And how successful have the requests been? I mean, when people are filing these requests, are they generally getting just rejected? Do they have to appeal? Sort of, how do you do that litigation that Jason was talking about?
Yeah. So I think that's a really great question. So I would say, I think a lot of times we heard, and this is kind of, you don't hear this as much. I think especially, thanks to the work of Jason, of Ken, and a lot of other people who are just doing fantastic FOIA work and being public about the fact that it was through FOIA that they're getting these documents. I think it depends what people are asking for. If people are asking for city budgets, if people are asking for some very basic stuff, very high success rate. If you're asking for something from the CIA, much lower success rate. If you're asking something from the New York Police Department, almost non-existent success rate, because that's one of the most secretive agencies out there. But it really varies. I think one of the things I always tell people is FOIA is like a muscle. Not all of your requests are going to be successful in netting things. Sometimes you're not going to get this, but by filing requests, you kind of get a feel for what's out there. And also you're helping train agencies that FOIA is something that they have to do. I think what we saw a decade ago was that, particularly at the local level, a lot of agencies never received requests and weren't really good at processing them. And when they did get requests, they got really defensive. FOIA is just the law. It's not an adversarial action. It's basically somebody wanting to take advantage of their rights in a democracy. So success rate, 1 out of 3 requests that we've seen filed on our platform gets a response in sort of a reasonable time and sort of gets documents. But sometimes no responsive documents can be a really interesting response as well. If you're asking for people, have they planned for this event? We don't have any documents on that. That can be an interesting answer. And rejections. I think it's become increasingly important to kind of highlight when agencies are not transparent. And I think this is something that a lot of times journalists say, hey, people don't want to really care about how the sausage is made. People don't really want to know about the FOIA process. And what we find is that when you kind of tell people like, hey, this police department says that they can withhold the names of their police officers, that's something a lot of people care about. When an agency says, we're going to not tell you how we're spending your tax dollars, that's something a lot of people care about. And so I think even in rejections, even in no responsive documents responses, a lot of times there's really interesting stories there.
And so in general, would you advise ordinary people or journalists to try and get local or state level documents as opposed to federal? Is that a higher success rate?
I would generally say that federal is a much slower process. It's a much more bureaucratic process. And so I think generally speaking, federal FOIA officers have more training. There is a professionalized FOIA class at the federal level. So FOIA officers in and out with different administrations. And so it's a more predictable, more bureaucratic process for good and ill. At the local level, I think there's a much bigger need for people to ask really basic questions. And so one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time doing is sort of working with different advocacy groups and different journalism organizations to do sort of FOIA campaigns where we'll take one issue, maybe that's water quality, maybe that's policing, maybe that's, whatever, education, and sort of say, hey, everybody around the country, let's all file the same request in hundreds of different communities and then start comparing the results. And that way you're getting a really fascinating data set, but then you're also sort of reminding local agencies that, you know, FOIA is part of our job, just like taking the trash out and everything else.
Now, how do you deal with a rejection? Is there a way for people to use Muckrock to appeal?
Yeah, so we've been working on building up an exemption and an appeals database where we try to collect all the different ways that requests can be rejected and put together sample language that users can use to kind of copy and paste an appeal, essentially, depending on what that rejection is. Not all states have an appeals process. I think about 40, I think, states have some kind of administrative appeals process. But states that don't, you have to litigate after that, or you can negotiate or name and shame them. So even if there's not an official appeals process, sometimes you can kind of nudge them in some other ways. But yeah, we also have staff that's really knowledgeable and experienced with FOIA, and that's always happy to kind of take a look at a request and offer advice in terms of, hey, what's the best way of kind of going back. And sometimes the right answer isn't an appeal. I think one of the things that Jason and Ken both mentioned, and Beth, is sort of like figuring out sort of what's another avenue towards those documents, right? I think a lot of times maybe it's, hey, let's take a step back. You're interested in this program. Maybe there's a state or agency that'll have some information. Or maybe it's, instead of asking for any documents about this incident, you go out and ask for like these specific incident reports that, you know, that might be a better request. So sometimes it's going forward with an appeal. Sometimes it's finding access to legal resources. There's a lot of lawyers around the country that really do value transparency work and are either willing to do a pro bono or are connected to institutions that are dedicated to transparency litigation these days.
And so I guess you talked a bit about how you have a template for appeals. Do you have templates for FOIA requests at different, or I guess public records requests at different jurisdictions? So if someone, you know, doesn't know what to ask for or how to phrase it, you know, there's a sense that this is what people have asked for in the past. This is what works. This is the language to use. Yeah.
So we do. We have letters that we have a tool that kind of walks you through that process. We tried taking it down to just sort of 2 steps. And so you say, hey, this is where I want to file my request. It puts together language that's specific to that jurisdiction and cites the deadline, cites the correct law. Just trying to make it as simple a process as possible. Because I know when I was first getting into FOIA myself and public records myself, I really labored over what's the exact right language. And so people see all these sort of like 4-page templates out there. They'll see the kinds of requests that lawyers will take to court, and they'll start putting pieces of that into their standard public records requests. We think generally keeping something that's simpler, more focused, and really make sure that you're very clear about what you actually want. That's the key thing. And so we help customize those letters based on the jurisdiction, but then you can browse all the other public requests on Muckrock and sort them by different agency or different topic, and sort of look for successful requests that are similar to what you want, and then kind of clone and tweak that request maybe to a different agency. So maybe one of our other users got something about police misconduct. You're interested in the same information in your city. You can clone that request, change the agency, click file, and then that process has already started.
And I mean, it seems when you're talking about the exemptions, when you're talking about the right language, that's customized to each jurisdiction. How do you keep track of all the different state level Freedom of Information Act laws and their exemptions and their caveats, and ensure that, you know, someone who's filing it in one state, if they're used to a different state's laws, they'll be able to file a similar request?
I think that's really one of the powerful things about building a community, right? Because we're constantly kind of getting incoming responses from different agencies. And so as we see rejections, as we see successes, those kind of then get baked into that database and baked into our website so that we're constantly learning, hey, what do you need to know as a requester in this given state? Now, the good news is that most of these laws generally work pretty similarly to each other. It's not like you have one state that, things are totally different. Like there was the federal law, and then most of the state laws are kind of modeled after the federal law. And so the general contours are very similar. Now, there are major differences. For example, in Massachusetts, where I've lived for a number of years now, the legislature and the governor are exempt from public records laws. There's not a whole lot of governors that are exempt from FOIA, I think with the exception of Michigan at this point. So there are important differences, and so we try to find ways to kind of make that easy. And we also have 50 different state guides, so that if you go to muckrock.com/place, you can look up your state and sort of see, okay, in a general sense, does my state have a deadline? Does it have an administrative appeals process? What are some of the key things I need to know about that? And really try to keep that as simple and accessible as possible, because I think for a long time, there was a lot of gatekeeping around FOIA. And I think people sort of said, oh, I'm a veteran, I did a lot of trainings in newsrooms, and most newsrooms for a long time, they had the one FOIA person. And I think that culture was really damaging in terms of, kind of mystifying the process for a lot of people. But as everybody else on this conversation has said, this is, the fundamentals are really basic. This is about, you have a right to documents unless an agency can cite an exemption. You don't need to know any magical language. You don't need to be a credentialed journalist. You don't need to be a citizen of the United States in most cases to file a records request. And that's really powerful. And I think that simplicity is really important. And I think, trying to create resources that are approachable and easy, because this should be a process that everybody has access to.
So if you are a local journalist, or just an ordinary person, a normal person, a non-journalist, and you wanted to file a public records request through Muckrock, how would you go about doing that? What advice would you have for people if they were inspired by this program to start filing FOIA requests? What should they do?
Yeah, I think just go to muckrock.com and then click FOI, or try to remember what that, just kind of browse through the site and look for requests that you find are interesting, and get a feel for sort of what has been out there that's, interesting to you, right? Because I think we've had fascinating requests from agencies with this, like the CIA, looking at their national security programs, to sort of dog registration data at the local level, to sort of policing, to how our tax dollars are being spent, to whole broad range of issues. One of my favorite requests was a request for sort of food recall notices, because the person was a beat writer, and they're really interested in sort of what are Trader Joe's brands really after you take off the labeling. And so they used food recall notices to figure out sort of who actually makes those tortilla chips that Trader Joe's sells. Like, this is stuff that's relevant to everybody, that's fascinating and interesting. And I think Ken's metaphor of FOIA being this the exhaust port of the surveillance state, even non-national security agencies, every agency is just generating all sorts of new databases, all sorts of new information. All of this information is being digitized. And so there's so many new opportunities coming out there for requesters to kind of think through, hey, what could be interesting, and go after it. And that's, even goofy stuff like people have been requesting sort of the automated messages that public transit uses to warn you about closing the door, and making sound machines based off public transit and that sort of thing. So I think there's really endless new types of requests that are out there. And so, bringing creativity, bringing sort of new perspectives to this field is just really important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for coming on the program and for creating Muckrock. I think that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank Mike. I want to thank Beth and Ken. I want to thank Jason as well. You guys, thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your experiences with public records and giving some advice on FOIA. Everyone who's watching, please follow our guests on Twitter. That's at Ken Klippenstein, at Beth Borden, at Jason Leopold, and at Morrissey. Make sure to go to muckrock.com and sign up and start filing your own FOIA requests in public records. We'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, if you want to contact the show, you can email me at sternlook@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at sternlook. And of course, if you're not already a member of HAPS, you can join HAPS. Just go to haps.tv. If you join HAPS, you'll also be able to directly support the show by becoming a monthly sponsor, since Sternlook is entirely viewer supported. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.